Hello and welcome to your Faith to Go. So we're going to continue to talk about this new sermon series called How Well Do You Know? And we're going to look at the 12 disciples this week. But the question I want us to consider, because the disciples is all about that they were called. And they thought they were called to one thing. They ended up being called to some things they never expected to be called to do. But the thing we often lift up about them is that they answered the call. They weren't perfect. We know that for sure. They certainly didn't understand everything that was happening or even all the things that Jesus was teaching. They often made lots and lots of mistakes, and that's okay. Jesus didn't kick them out, except for Judas, but he made a really big mistake. He he'd admonish them. He'd try to explain it differently. He'd try to tell it in a new way. He got frustrated when they couldn't stay up, but stay awake and pray with him. So it was a real relationship, but they stuck it out, and so did he. So that's one of the reminders about being called by God, that there's not just one chance to do it. It's not like, man, if I don't get it right exactly the first time, this is never going to work. It doesn't mean we don't get called multiple times to very different things. We so often just use that call language for ministers. Like, we're big on that, like, oh, what's your call story? But everybody is called. Everybody who's here, everybody who's already showing up is called by Jesus. We just have to pay attention to what we think we're being called to do. So that's the question for you that'll get explored a little bit in the sermon this week, which is, how well do you know what God is calling you to do? Because sometimes the call falls into things that make total sense to us. Like, oh, I'm good at this thing, so I should do this in ministry. Maybe you're good with numbers or money, and so you help with, you're the treasurer, you help with stewardship campaign. If you are a teacher, then maybe you end up leading a Bible study, or you work with Worship and Wonder. So sometimes that's how it works. It goes with the skills that we're already matched up in. Sometimes, though, and we see this in the disciples again and again, we end up doing stuff we never expected God to call us to do. Tied into our camp story last week, as I talked about, I never intended to go to camp. I tried to make it abundantly clear to the last church that not only should I not go to camp, I'd be bad at camp wouldn't suit me. Now I'm the one that wants to have a camp Sunday every single year because I loved it. God surprised me. God gave me decade-long relationships there. I bonded with kids there in ways I never could back at my home church, just by the sheer amount of time together. There have been any number of things that I've gotten called to do that I never thought I'd end up doing, let alone that I'd be good at. Now, there's some other things I thought I would be good at. Here's my funny story. So at the old church, I was in charge of spiritual formation, and so I would lead the Bible studies, I would lead a book club, and 3 people would show up. 5 people would show up to this one. Every once in a while at work, and it wouldn't. Well, when I finally gave it away, I had one person say, I'd like to keep the book club going, can I lead it? Her first session, 14 people showed up. Then I had someone saying, we really need a women's Bible study here, and I was like, you'd be great at that. And when she finally got over her nervousness about it, she ended up leading a highly successful women's Bible study for the next 5 years. It started out as a 6-week Bible study. She did it for 5 years. Incredibly faithful. So part of my call was to get out of the way. I wasn't called to lead at that time. I was called to do some other things in the place, to lift up other people, to lead, and to take ownership over those ministries. Which now I love to do. I love helping people find ways to lead, find ways to discover that they have gifts for ministry that they didn't even know they had. That's one of the most fun things that I get to do. I get to do a bunch of fun things in ministry. So the call can be sometimes fit right up and line up right with your gifts. That's great. But sometimes you get called outside your comfort zone because that's where God can surprise you the most. It's the same thing as if you decide to go do camp, if you decide to help with the mission trip, even though you've never done that before. Maybe you decide to lead a group here. I'd love to get a book club going at one of the bookstores. I really want some groups to start meeting outside the church's doors so people can see us doing faith, not just in here, if that's something that's laying on your heart. So this week we're thinking about the fact that A, God calls all of us. 2, you don't have to be perfect or ready or know the answer to be called. And 3, where God calls you might be surprising. So it might be a part to add to your prayers this week and ongoing about, do I really know what God is calling me to do here and now in this season of my life? Which might be very different from other seasons of your life. You may have been called to very particular things then, but in this particular season, at this time, at this church, what am I being called to do? So in that spirit, let's go to God in prayer. God who calls and welcomes and beckons. We are listening. We want to respond to your call here and now in this place at this time, where you are calling First Christian Church of Louisville to be. Who are we called to be here and now? In a world coming out and living through a pandemic endemic. In a world where institutions are just not trusted in the ways they were before. Where there's so much suspicion and uncertainty about organized religion. We are still followers of your Son, Jesus. We still believe we have the best story that's ever been told. How are you calling us to tell it here and now, in this place, with these people gathered here? Who needs to hear it, and how do you want us to share it? We continue to ask for your blessing and your strength this week as we do our best to be faithful to you, to be grateful to you, to remember that we are loved and forgiven and seen by you. We ask all these things in the holy name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. As always, my friends, be well, be safe. Think about where God is calling you.